After I paid for my wife's dental school for 6 years, she handed me divorce papers at her own graduation party, and when I refused to sign them right there like some obedient dog, she made a mistake so catastrophic that it destroyed everything she'd spent years planning. I'm Adam, and this is how I went from being the guy who sacrificed everything for his wife's dream to the man who watched that same wife lose absolutely everything she thought she'd won. 6 years ago, my wife got accepted into dental school, and I made a decision that seemed noble at the time, but turned out to be the biggest mistake of my life. I told her to focus completely on her studies while I handled everything else: the rent, the bills, her tuition, her books, even her car payments and insurance. I was working 60 to 70 hours a week as an IT project manager, picking up every overtime shift I could get, skipping lunches to save money, turning down promotions that would have required travel because I needed to be home to support her. My friends started having game nights and weekend trips that I couldn't join because I was either working or too exhausted to function, and slowly, one by one, they stopped inviting me altogether. I told myself it was temporary, that once she graduated and started making that doctor salary, we'd travel together, buy a house, maybe start a family, and I'd finally get to breathe again. But somewhere around year 4, she started changing. She became distant and cold, spent more time studying at her friend Melanie's apartment than at home. And when I tried to talk to her about it, she'd snap at me about the stress of school and how I couldn't possibly understand the pressure she was under. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, and I kept telling myself that once graduation came, once the stress lifted, we'd get back to being us again. The graduation party was at this upscale event venue downtown, the kind of place with valet parking and waiters in bow ties carrying trays of champagne, and her entire dental school class was there along with their families and significant others. I'd bought a new suit for the occasion, my first new clothes in probably 2 years, and I was genuinely excited because I thought she'd finally acknowledge everything I'd done, maybe even thank me in front of everyone for making her dream possible. Instead, about an hour into the party, she pulled me aside toward this outdoor garden area where it was quieter, and I noticed her friends Melanie and 2 others watching us through the window with these weird smirks on their faces. She handed me a manila envelope, and when I opened it, I found a complete set of divorce documents, already filled out, already notarized, just waiting for my signature. The world kind of tilted sideways for a second, and I remember asking her what this was, like maybe it was some kind of sick joke, but her face was cold and serious in a way I'd never seen before. She told me that she'd outgrown me, that she was a doctor now and I was just some IT guy, and then she said the words that are burned into my brain forever. She said, "You're not on my level anymore, Adam. You should date someone more like-minded, someone in your own league." The way she said it was so casual, like she was suggesting I try a different coffee shop, and I could hear her friends giggling through the window behind us. She actually expected me to sign right there, right then, at her graduation party, probably so she could celebrate her freedom with her classmates the moment I walked out, but something in me just snapped into clarity. I looked at her standing there in her expensive dress that I'd paid for, holding her champagne glass, surrounded by the success that my sacrifice had built, and I told her I wasn't signing anything, not tonight, not without understanding what was really happening, and that she didn't get to write the ending to my story anymore. Her face went from confident to confused to angry in about 3 seconds, because apparently she'd never considered the possibility that I might say no, and she started raising her voice about how I was being difficult and unreasonable, but I just walked away. Left the party, left her standing there with her unsigned divorce papers and her shocked friends staring through that window. The next morning she showed up at our apartment without warning, saying she needed to grab some things and stay for a few days while she figured out her next move. And she was acting like this was all perfectly reasonable, like she could just hand me divorce papers one day and move back in the next. But I'd spent the whole night thinking, lying awake in our bed that suddenly felt too big, and I'd realized something important. The lease was only in my name because her credit had been garbage when we moved in 3 years ago, and legally, she had no right to be there anymore. I told her she could take her personal items, but she couldn't stay, that this was my apartment now, and she absolutely lost it, screaming about how I was being petty and cruel and vindictive. But she left because deep down she knew I was right, and she had no legal ground to stand on. In her rush to get out, probably planning to crash at Melanie's place and regroup, she forgot her laptop sitting on the kitchen counter, and that's when I found everything. 6 months of text messages with some guy named Camden who she'd met at a dental conference. Messages talking about how she couldn't wait to be free, how I was just a stepping stone, how she played me perfectly, and I never even saw it coming. There were discussions about her secret bank account with over $30,000 that her parents had been sending her as so-called emergency money throughout school, money she'd never mentioned to me once in 6 years. There were messages with her friends planning exactly how this graduation party confrontation would go, how quickly I'd sign because I was so predictable and passive, how they'd all go out dancing afterward to celebrate her new life, without me dragging her down. I took photos of everything, backed it up to 3 different cloud services, printed physical copies, and called a divorce attorney first thing Monday morning. And when I showed him what I'd found, he actually smiled and said, "Your wife isn't just leaving you, Adam. She's been running a con, and we're about to blow it wide open." That's when I realized this wasn't just about a divorce anymore. This was about justice, and I was going to make sure she understood exactly what happens when you treat someone's love like a business transaction. But I had no idea that the very next evening, someone would knock on my door with a plan that could have destroyed everything I was building, a plan that would show me just how far she was willing to go to win this war she'd started. The person at my door was Melanie, my wife's best friend from dental school, and she was wearing a tight dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination and carrying a bottle of wine that I knew cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She had this supposedly concerned look on her face and told me she was worried about me, that she knew I must be going through such a hard time, and that she'd found something of my wife's in her car that she needed to return, but her eyes were doing this weird thing where they kept dropping to my lips and then back up. Every alarm bell in my head started ringing because Melanie had never once been nice to me in the 6 years I'd known her. She was the one who'd made jokes about my cheap clothes at parties and suggested my wife could do better, and now suddenly she was at my door playing concerned friend like we'd been close this whole time. I let her in because I wanted to see where this was going, call it curiosity or maybe just exhaustion from everything that had happened, and she immediately started touching my arm while talking, leaning in way too close, complaining about how hot it was even though it was like 60 degrees outside, and asking if I had anything cold to drink in this sultry voice that was absolutely ridiculous. She kept steering the conversation toward how lonely I must be, how my wife had treated me so badly and I deserved so much better, how any woman would be lucky to have a guy like me who was so dedicated and hardworking and clearly very attractive. And that's when I noticed her phone was positioned on the coffee table with the camera facing directly toward the couch where we were sitting. That's when it clicked like a light switch in my brain. This wasn't a friendly visit or even a legitimate seduction attempt. This was a setup. My wife had sent her best friend to try to seduce me, or at least make it look like something inappropriate happened, so she could use it as evidence that I was the one who cheated, that I was the bad guy in all this, that she was justified in everything she'd done. I almost laughed at how stupid they thought I was, like I wouldn't notice a phone recording or wouldn't recognize the most obvious honey trap in history. And I looked directly at her phone camera and said loud and clear that I appreciated her concern, but I wasn't interested in any kind of relationship or physical situation with her, that I was focused on my divorce proceedings, and she should probably leave now before this got any more awkward. The look on Melanie's face was absolutely priceless, pure panic mixed with embarrassment, because she realized I'd figured out the whole plan, and now she had nothing to show for it except a recording of me politely rejecting her, and she grabbed her phone and practically sprinted out of my apartment without another word, not even bothering to take that expensive bottle of wine she'd brought as a prop. I immediately called my lawyer and told him what had just happened, every detail of the attempted setup, and he told me to document everything and be prepared, because if they were trying this hard to create false evidence, it meant they were desperate, and desperate people make mistakes, big mistakes that we could use against them. 2 days later, I got a Facebook message from someone I barely knew, Claire, another woman from my wife's dental school class who I'd maybe talked to twice at parties where she'd seemed nice but quiet, definitely not part of my wife's core friend group. She said she needed to meet with me, that it was important, and she couldn't say more over text because she didn't know who might see it. And normally I would have ignored it because I was paranoid after the Melanie incident, but something about the message felt genuine, urgent in a way that seemed different from Melanie's obvious trap. We met at a coffee shop way across town, somewhere far from anyone we knew, one of those independent places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. And the moment Claire sat down, she started crying. Not dramatic sobbing, but quiet tears like she'd been holding something in for way too long and finally had permission to let it out. She told me she couldn't be part of this anymore, that what my wife was doing was wrong, and she couldn't watch it happen without saying something, that she'd been losing sleep over it for weeks. And then she handed me a flash drive that she said contained everything I needed to know about what was really going on. That night, I plugged it into my laptop with my hands actually shaking because I had no idea what I was about to find, and what I found was worse than I'd imagined. Screenshots of group chats going back months where my wife was the ringleader, messages where she was coaching Melanie on exactly how to seduce me and make it look natural, what to wear, what to say, how to position her phone for the best angle. There were voice memos of my wife laughing about how easy it would be to manipulate the divorce in her favor, how judges always sided with women anyway, how I was too stupid and trusting to put up a real fight. Bank statements showing that her parents had been sending her $2,000 a month for the past 3 years as allowance that she'd hidden from me, money that was supposed to be for emergencies but that she'd been stockpiling for her escape plan. And most damning of all, text messages discussing how to fabricate evidence of me being controlling or abusive, conversations about changing the locks while I was at work and claiming I'd done it to trap her, about saying I'd threatened her even though I'd never raised my voice to her in 6 years, about having Camden pretend to be a neutral witness if needed. They'd planned every detail of not just leaving me, but destroying my reputation in the process. Claire's message at the end of the flash drive said she'd watched my wife become someone she didn't recognize anymore, someone cruel and calculating who treated people like chess pieces, who'd turned this divorce into some kind of game where winning meant completely destroying me, and that I deserved to know the truth even if it cost Claire her entire friend group and social circle. My lawyer looked at everything Claire had given me, and his whole demeanor changed from professional confidence to something almost predatory. He'd gone from thinking we'd win to knowing we were going to absolutely demolish her in court, because what we had wasn't just evidence of infidelity, but evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted manipulation of the legal system, which judges absolutely hate. He filed emergency motions, requested immediate hearings, and suddenly my wife's perfect plan started crumbling faster than she could control, like watching a sandcastle get hit by a wave. I found out through mutual acquaintances that Camden had dumped her right after he found out about the divorce proceedings. Apparently, he'd only been interested in a successful dentist with money and stability, not a woman in the middle of a messy divorce who might come out of it with nothing. And without him backing her up, her whole fantasy future just disappeared like smoke. Her friends started distancing themselves one by one because Claire had apparently sent them all copies of the same evidence she'd given me, showing them exactly how my wife had been using them as pawns in her scheme, lying to them about what was happening, and suddenly the support system she'd counted on just evaporated. Her parents called me out of the blue, which was absolutely surreal because they'd always treated me like I wasn't good enough for their daughter, like she was settling by being with some IT guy instead of a doctor or lawyer, and they apologized for not seeing what was really happening. They'd been sending money because she told them I was financially controlling her, that she needed an escape fund for her safety, and they were horrified to learn she'd been lying about everything while living off both their money and mine. The divorce proceedings turned into a complete nightmare for her. Every lie she'd told was exposed in court documents. Every manipulation tactic documented with screenshots and voice memos. Every hidden asset discovered and cataloged by forensic accountants my lawyer brought in. Meanwhile, Claire and I had started talking more, meeting for coffee every week. And what started as her feeling guilty about being part of my wife's circle for so long turned into these long conversations about life and dreams and what we actually wanted from our futures. And I realized I was talking to someone who actually listened, who actually cared about my answers, who treated me like an equal instead of a stepping stone to something better. 6 months after that graduation party confrontation, my divorce was finalized with terms that shocked everyone who knew about the case. I got the apartment, the car, 60% of our combined assets, including a portion of that secret account her parents had funded, and she got a reputation in her professional circles that followed her everywhere she went because word spreads fast in the dental community. Claire and I started dating officially about a month after the divorce was final, not because she was some rebound, but because somewhere in all that darkness she'd been the one person who chose to do the right thing even when it cost her everything. And that kind of character is rare, the kind you build a life with. A year later, I proposed to Claire at the same coffee shop where she'd handed me that flash drive. Got down on one knee right there between the mismatched chairs and local art, and she said yes while crying the same quiet tears she'd cried that first day. Except this time they were happy ones, and she was smiling through them. We planned a small wedding, nothing fancy, just 50 people at a garden venue. The people who actually mattered to us and had supported us through everything. And I thought maybe finally I could close this chapter of my life and move forward into something better. But then my wedding day arrived, and I learned that my ex-wife had one final play left. one last desperate attempt to rewrite the story and make herself the victim, and it was going to happen right in front of everyone I loved in the most dramatic way possible. The wedding venue was this beautiful garden space with string lights everywhere and flowers that Claire had picked out herself. Exactly the kind of simple, elegant setup that she'd dreamed about since she was a kid, and we'd kept the guest list small, maybe 50 people total, just close friends and family who'd actually supported us through everything and knew the whole story. The ceremony had been perfect. Claire looked absolutely stunning in her dress with her hair done up and these little flowers woven into it. And when we said our vows, I actually meant every single word, unlike the first time I'd stood at an altar making promises I thought were forever. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. We were about halfway through the reception, right after our first dance, to some song Claire had picked that made her cry happy tears, when I noticed some commotion near the entrance and saw our venue coordinator, this professional woman we'd hired to handle logistics, trying to physically block someone from coming in. My stomach dropped because I recognized that voice even before I saw her face, that particular pitch and tone that I'd heard a million times before, and suddenly I knew exactly what was about to happen. My ex-wife pushed past the coordinator and stumbled into the reception area wearing what looked like a wrinkled cocktail dress that had definitely seen better days, something she'd probably worn to clubs back in dental school, and her hair was a mess. Her makeup was smudged like she'd been crying for hours, and she was clearly not in any state to be crashing someone's wedding. The music stopped dead, conversations died mid-sentence, and every single person in that garden turned to look at this woman who'd just burst into a private event uninvited. And I felt Claire's hand tighten around mine, but her face stayed completely calm, almost eerily composed, like she'd been mentally preparing for this exact possibility for weeks. My ex-wife's eyes locked onto mine with this desperate intensity, and she started walking toward us, wobbling slightly in her heels on the grass, and she was saying my name over and over like it was some kind of magic word that would fix everything. Like if she just said it enough times, I'd remember who we used to be. She dropped to her knees right there in front of the head table where Claire and I were sitting, dirt and grass staining that wrinkled dress, and started this rambling speech about how she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, how she'd thrown away the only man who ever really loved her, how we were meant to be together, and this wedding was wrong. All of this was wrong. I was making a terrible mistake. She kept saying she'd changed, that losing everything had made her realize what actually mattered, that Camden had been a mistake and her friends had been toxic influences, and she'd been blind, but now she could see clearly, and she was begging me to stop this, to call off the wedding, to come back to her, and give her another chance to be the wife I deserved, the wife she should have been from the start. The entire room was frozen in this awful silence, watching this scene unfold like it was some kind of reality TV show or dramatic movie. And I could see some of Claire's relatives looking uncomfortable, probably wondering what kind of drama they'd walked into and whether they should leave. Part of me actually felt sorry for her in that moment, because she'd lost absolutely everything. Her relationship with Camden had crashed and burned. Her friend group had abandoned her after the truth came out. Her reputation in the dental community was destroyed because word had spread about the divorce details and the attempted fraud. And apparently she'd been struggling to build a patient base because nobody wanted a dentist who was known for being manipulative and dishonest. But then I remembered that graduation party, remembered her cold eyes when she'd handed me those divorce papers, remembered every single text message on that flash drive where she'd laughed about playing me and called me stupid and predictable, and any sympathy I might have felt just evaporated like water on hot pavement. I stood up slowly, walked around the table while everyone watched, and looked down at her still kneeling on the ground with mascara running down her face, and I said one word, just one single word that contained everything I needed to say. I said no. Not no with an explanation or justification, not no with anger or emotion or even satisfaction, just a simple calm no that made it absolutely clear there was nothing she could say or do that would change my answer, that this chapter was closed and locked, and she wasn't getting back in no matter how much she cried or begged. She started crying harder, reaching for my hands with her own shaking ones, saying she'd do anything. She'd go to therapy. She'd make it up to me. She'd spend the rest of her life proving she'd changed and become a better person. But I just stepped back and nodded to our security guy, who we'd hired specifically because Claire had worried something exactly like this might happen. He was this big professional bouncer type who Claire's brother knew from his gym, probably 6'4" and built like he could carry a car. And he came over and very gently but firmly helped my ex-wife to her feet and started guiding her toward the exit while she was still crying and calling my name. Her voice got quieter as he walked her out, fading from desperate pleas to broken sobs. And then the door closed behind them, and suddenly she was just gone, removed from my life as completely as if she'd never existed. The moment that door clicked shut, Claire stood up, walked over to the DJ stand, and took the microphone with this amazing composure that made me fall in love with her all over again. And she addressed our guests with this perfect mix of grace and steel. She thanked everyone for coming, acknowledged that weddings can bring up complicated emotions for people, especially those who might be struggling with their own lives, and suggested we all get back to celebrating, because she'd just married the love of her life and nothing was going to ruin this day that we'd planned so carefully. The applause started slowly but built into this thunderous ovation, people actually standing up and clapping like they were at a concert. And just like that, the tension broke and the party continued like nothing had happened. People started dancing again, the bar reopened, and life moved forward the way it always does. Later that night, after the reception ended and we were alone in our hotel room with our shoes kicked off and Claire's hair finally let down, she told me she'd actually expected my ex to show up, that she'd seen the social media stalking and the occasional drive-bys past my apartment building in the weeks leading up to the wedding, and she'd prepared herself mentally for some kind of confrontation. She said she wasn't threatened by it because she understood the difference between someone who loves you and someone who just hates losing, and my ex-wife had proven definitively which category she fell into with that desperate scene in front of everyone. We spent our honeymoon in Hawaii, 2 full weeks of actually relaxing and being happy without looking over our shoulders or checking our phones every 5 minutes. And when we got back, I'd completely blocked my ex on everything and made it clear through my lawyer that any further contact would result in a restraining order and possible harassment charges. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to a different city about 3 hours away, trying to start over somewhere people didn't know her story or what she'd done, and honestly I hoped she found some kind of peace eventually, not for her sake, but for mine, because holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Claire and I bought a house 6 months after the wedding, a real house with a yard and room to grow and maybe eventually space for kids if we decided we wanted them. And we started building the life I'd always imagined, but with someone who actually valued what I brought to the table instead of seeing me as temporary. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd sacrificed everything for someone who saw me as beneath her, and ended up with someone who saw me as an equal partner worth fighting for. Sometimes the universe has a weird sense of humor about these things. My ex-wife kept my last name for almost 2 years after the divorce before finally changing it back, and I found out later through a mutual acquaintance that she'd done it because she thought keeping it might leave the door open somehow. Like maybe I'd see it as a sign she still considered us connected and might change my mind. But that door had closed the moment she handed me those divorce papers at her graduation party. And the version of me who would have taken her back, who would have forgiven anything, who would have sacrificed himself again for her happiness, that version died in that garden while her friends watched through the window and laughed. The man I became after that, the one who said no, the one who fought back, the one who found Claire and built something real and lasting. That's who I was always supposed to be. And my ex-wife's biggest mistake wasn't just underestimating me. It was giving me the push I needed to finally see my own worth and stop settling for someone who saw me as less than I was. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.